The night sky above the sugarcane fields of Saint-Domingue glowed red with fire. Torches cut through the darkness. Drums pounded like thunder, and the cries of enslaved men and women echoed in the humid air. Shackled yesterday, armed today, this was not just a rebellion. This was the spark of something the world had never seen before. The enslaved rising, not only to break their chains, but to tear down an empire. To understand how this night began, you must step back into the daily life of Saint, the French colony that would one day be known as Haiti. It was the late 1700s, and this Caribbean island was the richest colony in the world. Vast plantations of sugar, coffee, and indigo lined the land. Ships sailed out of its ports, carrying half of Europe's sugar and most of its coffee. Wealth flowed into France, filling the pockets of aristocrats and merchants. But behind that wealth was agony. Nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans were forced to work the fields from dawn to nightfall under the whip of overseers. The sun baked their backs. Disease and hunger hollowed their bodies, and punishment for the smallest defiance was brutal lashes, mutilation, even death. For every white colonist living in luxury, there were dozens of enslaved people living in misery. The system was built to crush the human spirit. Families were torn apart when children were sold off. African languages and rituals were forbidden. Even rest was stolen. People were often forced to sleep in dirt huts before rising again at dawn to cut cane until their hands bled. The life expectancy of an enslaved person in Saint-Domingue was barely more than a decade. Yet, despite the cruelty, spirit endured. At night, when overseers retreated, enslaved men and women gathered in secret. They whispered in Creole, prayed to their African gods, and sang songs of freedom. Some still remembered their homeland's Congo. Igbawand carried fragments of those traditions. Out of this mix of pain and memory, a new culture was born, Haitian Creole. Voodoo ceremonies, the rhythms of drums. These were not just rituals, they were resistance. Among those enslaved were leaders who would one day change history. Toussaint Louverture, once a coachman and known for his intelligence, absorbed the ideas of the French Enlightenment. He had learned to read and had studied philosophy and military texts in secret. Others, like Jean-Jacques, carried an unbreakable fire in their hearts, hardened by suffering and fueled by rage. And then came news from across the ocean: the French Revolution. In Paris, the monarchy had been toppled, and ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity spread like wildfire. Free men of color in Saint-Domingue demanded equal rights. White colonists fought bitterly among themselves over loyalty to France. In the middle of this chaos, the enslaved majority began to see a chance. If liberty could be demanded in France, why not here, where chains still cut into flesh? The soil of Saint-Domingue was soaked with sugar and blood. Every lash of the whip, every broken body, every prayer whispered into the night carried the same unspoken truth: this system could not last forever. And one night in August 1791, under the cover of darkness and guided by the beat of sacred drums, the spark was lit. The enslaved set the plantations ablaze, torch by torch, until the sky itself seemed to burn. The world's most profitable colony became a battlefield, and history itself was about to change. Imagine standing in that burning field. You are enslaved, your ankles scarred from chains, your back torn from the whip. For years, you were told you were nothing more than property. But now you hold a blade, and the fire in your heart is stronger than your fear. You are not just fighting for survival, you are fighting for freedom." The uprising spread like wildfire. Thousands of enslaved men and women rose together. Plantations went up in flames, sugar mills collapsed, and white colonists fled in terror. For the first time, the oppressed had seized control of their own destiny. But the path ahead was brutal. France, unwilling to lose its wealthiest colony, sent soldiers to crush the revolt. Spain and Britain, smelling opportunity, invaded as well. Three great empires descended on Saint, and at the center of it all stood Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint was no ordinary leader. He studied European warfare, knew the land like the back of his hand, and inspired loyalty among his fighters. His army of former slaves barefoot, poorly armed, but burning with determination, regiment after regiment of trained European troops. He taught them guerrilla tactics, using the mountains and forests as shields. The battles were vicious. Fields became killing grounds. Rivers ran red, and disease swept through the armies. Yellow fever struck hardest at the Europeans, cutting down thousands. For every musket the rebels lacked, they carried courage. For every cannon they couldn't build, they had the will to endure. And then came Napoleon Bonaparte. Determined to restore French dominance, he sent his brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, with tens of thousands of troops, the largest expedition France had ever sent overseas. Napoleon believed his disciplined army would crush the rebellion in months, but he underestimated the spirit of the enslaved. Toussaint and his generals refused to yield. They fought village by village, hill by hill. Families who had suffered slavery now fought side by side. Knowing the stakes, victory meant freedom, defeat meant chains. The French tried trickery, offering negotiations. They lured Toussaint into a trap, capturing him and sending him across the ocean to a frozen cell in France, where he would die in 1803. Yet, even in captivity, Toussaint's words burned into history. "In overthrowing me, you have only cut down the trunk of the tree of liberty, but its roots are deep and strong. They will never be destroyed." With Toussaint gone, leadership passed to Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Unlike Toussaint's cautious diplomacy, Dessalines carried fury like a weapon. He rallied the fighters with a single demand: total freedom or death. And under his command, the rebels unleashed their full force. Napoleon's army, weakened by disease, hunger, and the relentless guerrilla war, crumbled. One by one, the mighty regiments fell. At the Battle of Vertières in November 1803, Dessalines' forces crushed the last of the French troops. The impossible had happened. Enslaved men and women had defeated Napoleon's empire. The conflict had cost unimaginable lives. Fields lay in ruins, cities burned, and families were shattered. But from the ashes, something the world had never seen before was about to rise up. Nation born not from conquest or colonization, but from rebellion against slavery itself. On January 1st, 1804, Dessalines stood before his people and declared independence. The new nation would be called Haiti, the old Taino name for the land, meaning mountainous country. And with that declaration, Haiti became the first free black republic in the world, the only nation in history born from a successful slave uprising. For the people who had known nothing but chains, this was more than victory. It was rebirth. Men, women, and children walked freely on soil where their ancestors had been whipped and beaten. The plantation system was shattered, no longer property. They were citizens of a nation they themselves had built through blood and sacrifice. But freedom came at a heavy price. The great powers of the world did not welcome Haiti. Slaveholding nations feared its example. The United States, terrified that enslaved people at home would follow Haiti's path, refused to recognize the new republic for decades. France demanded crippling reparations money. Haiti would be forced to pay for generations, just to compensate former slaveholders. The world tried to isolate Haiti, but its spirit endured. Inside the country, survival was hard. Plantations lay in ruins, trade collapsed, and the scars of war ran deep. Yet, despite all obstacles, Haiti's independence sent shockwaves across the globe. For enslaved people in the Americas, it was proof that liberation was possible. For colonizers and empires, it was a warning. And for history itself, it was a turning point. The Haitian Revolution did what no other uprising had done. It broke the chains of slavery, defeated one of the most powerful armies in the world, and declared equality for a people once treated as less than human. Think about that. In a world where the very idea of black freedom was considered impossible, Haiti made it undeniable. It stood as a living challenge to the lie of white supremacy, a beacon to the oppressed, and a reminder that power built on cruelty can never last forever. Of course, the years ahead would not be easy. Poverty, foreign interference, and political turmoil plagued Haiti. But no hardship could erase what had been achieved. A people who had been enslaved had written their own destiny. Even today, when you hear the word Haiti, remember that it was born in fire and struggle, but also in courage and hope. The Haitian Revolution was not just a chapter of history. It was a message to the world that freedom, once demanded, cannot be denied. And so, when we look back at that night in 1791, when the first flames lit the cane fields, we must remember those flames were not just destruction. They were the light of a new world struggling to be born. History must not be forgotten, because, in remembering Haiti, we remember that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can rise, fight, and win.